So I'm Arja Kuulalumi. I work at the Finnish Social Research Data Archive as a chief specialist, as Essi just told you. And I'm going to talk about our services for researchers. And today my contents are what should be taken into account when planning to open the data in FSD. And to explain in that, I tell you first what kind of data that are suitable for FSD, and then I talk you about ethical principles in opening data and data protection. The last section of my presentation is about pseudonymous data that are archived for further use and data that is archived for further use, including personal data. Now I have to say that these two kind of data, pseudonymous and data containing personal information, are rare cases in FSD. But we do have services for that kind of data as well. Most of the data that are archived in FSD are anonymous. So I'd say perhaps 95% of our datasets are anonymous. I will not talk you about the concrete process of data archiving, but since one of you had asked about what to do when it's about time to archive the dataset into FSD, I will try to remember shortly in the end of my presentation, give you the exact web page where you can find information for that. So what should be taken into account when planning to open the data in the FSD? I will go to the list telling you what kind of data is accepted for archiving in our data archive, but I don't have any slide on these small things, but I tell you as well. First is language. We archive datasets that are English, Swedish, or Finnish. That's the restriction concerning language. On very rare cases, we accept data that is another language, but in those cases, the research project has to conduct our data services before the data collection, so we can negotiate on the procedures of whether we accept the data in other language or not. If it's quantitative data, you can always, and it's collected, for instance, using survey from different kind of countries where they have different languages, then we usually archive the main dataset version that is in English, and contexted to that dataset there are the surveys that have been used in different languages. So that's the solution with quantitative data. But now what? And then another restriction is we don't archive audiovisual material. It is the Language Bank of Finland which archives that kind of data. And master thesis datasets may be archived, but only if the data are extensive enough to be used in research or teaching methods. So most of the master thesis datasets we don't accept to our data archive. Okay, so what kind of data are suitable for our data archive? The most common data, and it's over 80% of the data we have, and we have around 2,000 data sets at the time. Most of it are statistical data that are recorded in a data matrix. And quite often it's survey data. So people have answered to a survey questionnaire, but it can be other kind of data as well. So you can make data matrix from any kind of information, and we have other kind of data as well. But the most often kind of quantitative data is survey-based data. Then we have different kind of, and accept different kind of transcripts. They may be from face-to-face interview, they may be focus group transcripts, or they may be other kind of interaction situations that have been transcribed. It depends on the research project. Then we archive written data that is authored by research subjects. It's mostly nowadays, it's about some kind of thematic writings. Researchers, for instance, ask people, what do you think about this social security system, or have you experienced poverty in your family last year? Tell about your experiences, that kind of things. We archive pictures and photographs. They might be taken or drawn by researchers or by research subjects, research participants. If the latter is the case, so it's the pictures are or photographs taken by research participants, then the researcher must make agreement on a transfer of rights so that the photographs or pictures can be archived to our data archive for further use. We have guidelines in our data management handbook on that, and it's quite easy to make any kind of agreement about issues that deal with copyright much easier than making agreements concerning data protection. And then we archive articles and pictures that have been published in newspapers or magazines, but also illustrations and comics. And we may also archive, for instance, if you're researching literature and you have extracts from novels you have digitized and used in your research, we may archive that kind of data set as well. And that is possible because FSD has an agreement with the Copyist, the Copyright Society, which handles these rights of different kind of artists and journalists and people who have copyright protected works. We also accept material that a researcher has collected from traditional archive. And that means that researcher has used material that is actually in analogical form, but the researcher has digitized or photographed it. But then we need to have sufficient bibliographical information concerning each, say it, a picture or whatever. And then the researcher must have a permit from the traditional archive to do that. Usually the permit can be negotiated by simple email conversation. We can archive web pages, which presumably are static pictures. If someone wants to, for instance, research and analyze how the visual contents of certain kind of services change during times, that kind of material is possible to archive, and block texts that resemble quite a lot copyist or copyright protected agreement we have. But one very big restriction we do have, and it is that we do not archive social media data. Actually, this is not an absolute no. We can and may archive social media data if the platform is Finnish and all the material that the users of that platform, including privacy notices, code of conduct, terms of use, and things like that, allow collecting the data for research purpose, and also allowed that data to be preserved somewhere else, in this case in FSD, and then be delivered for further use. So you may understand it's quite a tricky business, and if you talk about things like Instagram, Facebook, and so on, that's very difficult, and actually so difficult we don't have time to do that kind of work. So now I told you what kind of data is accepted to our data archive, and now I tell you another important thing. If the data is collected from living persons, then it is utmost important that you have informed the research participants about archiving. We have ethical principles concerning human research in Finland, and it has these 3 statements about opening data. The first one tells that the degree of openness is determined on the basis of the data in question, taking into account both freedom of science and freedom of expression and the protection of personal data and privacy. Here are principles that are quite noble and important, and I tell you a bit about, in concrete way, I will discuss you about this, both freedom of science and freedom of expression, when we talk about the possibility of archiving data, including personal information of research participants. The second one tells that opening the research data must be considered already at the planning stage of the research. And that means that research participants must be informed at the data collection stage that the data will be opened. So if you have collected and analyzed a research data you wish to archive now, but you didn't think of that archiving for further use when collecting the data, then it's quite a tricky business to try to do that afterwards. If you have a small target group and you still have their contact information, then it's possible to inform them again and telling about the plans that you have changed and you wish to archive the research data. But usually it is a most fluent solution to think of these things already when you're planning to do your data collection. And when third one tells that when data contains or originally has contained personal data, and that is almost 100% the case if you research living people, then the code data controller is responsible for making the data open where applicable and in compliance with legislation. And I will refer to that fact later on when I go on. Informing about archiving, there are at least 3 significant points regarding archiving and the use on which the research participants should know. You may have different kind of documents where you tell about archiving. It could be research brochure, some kind of information sheet about your research. It could be cover letter, which is usually the case in survey research. It could be informed consent and privacy notice. I don't know about what kind of privacy notices right now each university recommends, but I've noticed that quite many universities have one section which is asking about what will happen to your research data when the research project ends. And then that is the case and place where you tell about your plan to archive your data. So the three issues are where the research data will be archived. So it's important for research participants that they know what is the place that is going to be responsible of the preserving of the data after the research has concluded. The second question is who will be granted access to the archived data for reuse. And third is for which purposes of reuse the archived data will be disseminated. We have different kind of access categories in FSD, and the informing about archiving has to resemble somehow to those categories, or if the researcher has not done the informing about archiving exactly the way that we guide researchers, then we just read with the researcher all documents and define with the researcher which is the suitable access category according to the information the researchers have got about archiving. We have in our data management guidelines three kind of ready-to-use examples, which actually include all those three issues which I told are important. On each of these examples, the first sentence is the same. The research data are offered for permanent archiving without personal data at the Finnish Social Science Data Archive. That is the sentence which tells you where the data will be archived. It also tells that it's anonymous data, which is set without personal data. I think ordinary people understand more easily without personal data or words like anonym or pseudonym. And it's good to communicate with your audience in a way that it's easily understandable, the text that you use. Then there's the second sentence in the first example. The archive may hand over the data for reuse to registered clients for research, teaching, and study. And here is the group where the data is released to. Who will have access to the data? It is the registered clients of FSD. You can register for our services by using your own university's username and password, which you have for university services and different kind of programs. That's how Finnish researchers and students register to be our client, and researchers and students for universities around the world have a different kind of register system. And then the sentence ended for research, teaching, and study. That means that the research data can be used not only for research, but also teaching, for instance, analysis methods, and then again for study, for doing lower level phases and seminar works and rehearsing different kind of analyzing methods. And this example one resembles to our archiving agreement and on the access category B. Example second, first sentence is quite the same, but then the reuse purposes is different. It's openly available for all users. And if you choose to inform your research participants like this, then it means that the data is right away downloadable from our data catalog. And we as an data archive organization wouldn't know who are the users and for what purposes are they using the data. Example 3 is same as the others, but the reuse purpose is different. It's for research only, but for that category we include also master's, doctoral, and applied sciences master thesis. And then I will go, these information examples are good if you anonymize your data set before data archive. Then I go to pseudonymous datasets. First, the definition. Pseudonymous data is the kind of data where the identification of persons cannot be done without the use of separately stored additional information. And examples of that kind of data are longitudinal research data. And if it's longitudinal data and it's archived as pseudonymous data, it means that we archive different collection waves before the study concludes and the research team permanently deletes the personal information of research participants. Another kind of example is research projects who, for one or another reason, wish and have planned and also have told in the privacy notices that they will preserve the personal information of the research participants, for instance, for 2 years or 3 years after the research concludes. Then it may be quantitative, it may be qualitative data. We at FSD reckon that kind of data pseudonymous as long as researchers hold and preserve the personal information of the research participants. Pseudonymization actually means it is like normal anonymization you do using anonymization techniques. It's easier to tell you that it means that, because if you have pseudonymous data, you certainly would not be able to identify the persons in that data set unless you have a possibility to lurk into the separately stored additional information that the research project has about the people. And the anonymization techniques and the personal informations are kept organizationally and technically separate from the pseudonymized data. Organizationally means that there are certain kind of rules, who can in the research project, who is named for handling the personal data, and who will have a username and password for processing that data. And technically separate means different kind of technical encryption methods or things like that. And as I told you already, data are pseudonymous as long as the separately stored personal data are destroyed. And after that, we can talk about anonymized data. So when informing about archiving, when the data are pseudonymous, there are some things you ought to know. Ethical principles pertain as in all research. So people ought to know what is happening with this data. They ought to know who handles it, to whom it handles over, that's FSD, and to whom FSD is releasing the data. But there are more things you have to take into account when it comes to data protection. And One thing is the GDPR rules. You ought to know who's controller and who's the processor of the data. And in this kind of situation, it is the rule that the original research project, regardless if it's the official controller is the organization or a person, then they remain the controller of the data set, and FSD acts only as in the role of a personal data processor. Then it's important to know who will be granted access to the pseudonymous data and how the access will be get from those who request the access for that, and for which purposes access will be granted. That's important. And it's very important to know are the data to be transferred outside the European Economic Area. So somehow you have to tell the research participants what is the division of work between the controller and processor. And then one important thing is when it's about pseudonymous data, which will finally at some point in the future become anonymous data, to know what are the reuse purposes for data set when it becomes fully anonymous. And when I told you that it's important to know if the data, pseudonymous data, are going to be transferred outside European Economic Area, and that's important. It's important just to follow and be GDPR compliant, but you would understand why it's important to FSD is the fact that we have customers in a lot of foreign universities. Here you have examples of those universities, and only just telling the location of those universities which have researchers or students who are our customers and download and use and analyze our data sets. Here I have an imaginary example of a quantitative longitudinal data, and this text is just a simplified example. In real life situation, the text certainly and naturally has to be customized by research. So in the cover letter of a survey, you could tell that the research data is offered for archive into FSD without personal information. And that tells that you don't transfer to FSD any kind of personal information. You don't have to tell the ordinary people that this is we will offer pseudonymized data. You may tell it, but most important is to tell issues so that ordinary people who attend to the research really understand what's happening. And then there's a sentence telling that during the research, FSD may only release data to registered customers for research and higher degree theses within the European Economic Area. That is the European area, and then countries for which the European Commission has determined the adequacy of personal data protection. Actually, most often researchers, whether they know, even if they know that they will, in the end of the project or during the longitudinal project, have pseudonymized data, they usually inform their research participants about the fact that they will not at all transfer personal data to outside European Economic Area. But yes, example where you have also possibility to deliver the data for those countries that have the adequacy of personal data protection. And for each release, separate permission must be requested from the research project. And that in practice means that if someone wishes to archive your pseudonymized dataset, they register to be our client, and then they make an access application, and we contact the representative of the data controller of the dataset and tell that this kind of application we got for your dataset, and can we release the data for that purpose? And if you need to discuss in more detail with the researcher, please contact the researcher yourself. And so the controller and the new data controller, which would be the reuser of the dataset, are discussing with each other and make some kind of agreements of using the data. And then the data controller, which is usually the depositor of the data, contacts FSD and tells that, yes, you can release the data for that purpose, or no, we don't give access to that. And when the research concludes, then it tells in the cover letter, after the research concludes, FSD will provide data to registered customers for research, teaching, and study purposes, regardless of the destination country. And that means actually that when the project ends and researchers delete all the personal information, our customers can download directly the dataset for research, teaching, and study purposes from our data catalog. And for this very same imaginary example, I have an text concerning privacy notice. And in the privacy notice, it is the section that handles about transfers of personal data to external parties where this information should be. Even though it's pseudonymized data and it doesn't include personal information, but since it could be connected to the information that research project has separately secured. So we ought to have this kind of system. The research project offers the data for archiving to FSD after each data collection phase. The data controller removes personal information from the material to be archived. FSD reviews and modifies the data for long-term storage and future use. And then during the research, registered customers of FSD can request usage permits for research data. The research project decides whether to give permission for requested data use or not. And in accordance with the guidelines and individual decisions given by the research project, FSD provides data to registered customers for research and higher degree theses, both within the European Economic Area and countries where the European Commission has determined the adequacy of personal data protection. So this could be one kind of example for that kind of, for pseudonymous data. Then I will go to the last section of my presentation, and that is about archiving datasets that will include personal data. And as I said in the beginning, I'd like to remind you that it is quite rare occasion that we will accept data including personal information on research participants. But we have few data sets, and I know there are coming few data sets in the future that will include personal information of the research participants. Data protection in this kind of situation is equivalent to the longitudinal data. So the examples of the text in cover letter and privacy notice can be used as some kind of guideline when preparing information about this kind of data. There is one exception. Every 10 years, we ask the data controller to give an assessment on the ground for storage to still go on. And for that reason, it is much easier to archive personal information if the controller is the organization, even though it's usually a certain person, perhaps principal investigator, who gives the permits. But since principal investigators, as we all die at some point, it's much easier to organize the system in cases the principal investigator cannot be contacted anymore, or for some reason there might be a period where the principal investigator cannot evaluate the data requests. So it's good to have an organization back there who takes the responsibility for that kind of data. Another thing is that you don't have to inform about the data being released for further purposes without asking the permission from the original principal investigator, because we always have to ask the permission if the data always contains personal information of research participants. When it comes to ethical evaluation regarding the archivability of personal data, it's good to know that we have the kind of system that we wish to discuss with the researcher already before the data collection begins, about certain points and viewpoints of how to make a decision whether there are enough grounds for archiving the personal data in the dataset that will be given for further use. One is the consent of research participants, and that means that have the research participant has been actively involved in the archiving of personal information of theirs relating to them. In qualitative research, you can ask separate permission for archiving the data, and in quantitative data as well, you may have one variable, one question asking about archiving the data at the end, with all the background variables, for instance. One viewpoint is the public notoriety of the participants. So it is more justified to include personal information of ordinary or people in general in the data if people are known from the research topic's point of view. And public awareness does not mean that people are known to the majority of people. Different kind of experts and artists can be known in their own field. For instance, politics and others using power in the society are often regarded as known people. Then there's the question of what is the nature of the content of the data set, and does it involve sensitive information, or does it are the data partially covered by copyright? The more sensitive the information is, the more cautious you have to be in maintaining the personal information. Whether data are more private in nature and content, then the content affects the assessment. For example, archiving social, cultural, and working life content with personal data is more justified than data concentrating on private life and family history of research participants. And copyright can also affect the retention of personal data, be it in a situation where you will interview, for instance, writers who have published novels, and they will tell you about their works in the interview. And what you may also interview researchers about their discipline and about the different points of the development of that discipline in scientific field, and that kind of content could also be evaluated in a way that the personal data, in this case names of those researchers, could be included in the data set. Then there's the fourth issue, public need for information. So are there generally and socially significant justifications for including personal information in the data? And the need to retain personal information should be assessed in relation to the importance of storing personal information in social, in cultural, and in scientific terms. A concrete example could be a very important big art exhibition. And that's actually a concrete example because there's going to be archived data set to our data archive about a very famous art exhibition that was called Finland 100, Suomi 100 vuotta. And for that research data, it is justified that one section includes personal information, and it is all the people who have been members of the working group who has carefully planned and curated this art exhibition. And on the other hand, there's another subset of that research, which includes interviews of people and visitors who have seen the art exhibitions and are telling in the interviews how they experience the data. And we wouldn't at FSD think that there are any justified reasons to include all the personal data of those visitors to the dataset. If data are archived, including personal information on research participants, it always must be minimized. And this means that all unnecessary personal data related to understanding the content of the data set and any information concerning private third persons must be removed from the data set. So that's the thing that we have to always do to that kind of data. And the information removed about the research participants may be, for instance, their phone numbers, email addresses, and other kind of personal information that's not really connected to the contents of data and the research. Okay, here is my presentation. I have this link for you all. You got the slides beforehand, and most of the most important section in our data management guidelines that I talked to you about is in the section 6, informing research participants about archiving. Thank you.